The trial gained no small amount of public attention, and on its opening day on the 13th of April 1886, the first of 6 days of trial began, surrounded by much media fanfare. At this stage, probably accounting to her foreigner status more than any other, Adelaide was not looked on well by the public, and everyone presumed that she would be found guilty with no shadow of doubt. At the trial, Adelaide was not permitted to give sworn evidence on her own behalf, as by law defendants were not given the choice of testifying until much later with the Civil Evidence Act of 1898. Instead, Adelaide's defence lawyer, Edward Clark, who was a leading member of the bar and had recently gained huge notoriety defending high-profile prisoners in court, maintained on her behalf that Edwin had committed suicide and highlighted evidence that would suggest said verdict. The Crown prosecution, on the other hand, put forward 3 possibilities to the jury, that of suicide, murder, and accidental death. In the first act, the jury was asked to excuse Dyson from guilt by the prosecution, which they presently did so. This was unusual, however, it gave the prosecutors advantage, as it now allowed Dyson himself to testify against Adelaide. Dyson promptly gave testimony that throughout January the pair had had many conversations concerning the chloroform he had purchased, and expressed that he had wanted to give his full account of the purchase to the police at the time, however had not done so due to Adelaide's insistence to keep quiet. He originally asked her what she had done with the chloroform before any suspicion of the chemical had been aroused, and she replied, "I have never used it. The bottle lies there full and uncorked. This is a very critical time for me, and you mustn't worry me with questions. Put away from your mind the fact that you ever gave me chloroform." The Reverend was clearly troubled by it, however, and 2 days later asked her again, whereby she apparently seemed very frustrated, stamped her foot and shouted to him, "Oh, damn the chloroform," insisting that if he did not incriminate himself, she would not incriminate him. He stopped questioning her after a final outburst when she yelled at him, "Why don't you charge me outright for administering chloroform to my husband?" Naturally, the very next thing the Reverend did was exactly the opposite to avoid incrimination. He took it upon himself to discard all 4 of the small empty bottles that he had originally purchased by throwing them into a ditch in Wandsworth Common on his way to church one morning. Appearing to nail the coffin lid home, Annie Walker, the nurse who Adelaide had told Reverend Dyson had purchased her chloroform on occasion before, and who was apparently now in America, testified that she had never bought chloroform, nor had she ever visited America. In fact, she had never left England in her life. Despite all of this looking very damning for Adelaide, the doctors testified as to the difficulty of killing someone with chloroform. Dr. Leach also gave testimony to their relationship, stating that throughout Edwin's illness, Adelaide had been incredibly helpful in nursing him. She was most affectionate. In fact, I could not wish for a better nurse. Their relationship was also described in detail, including the bizarre peculiarities of the odd love triangle. However, at the same time, it was insisted that their relationship was not damaged at all by these circumstances. As far as the evidence which we have to offer to you on the part of the Crown, and of course we shall put before you all the evidence we have, whether it makes for or against the prisoner at the bar, does not point to the existence of any quarrel between husband and wife. They seem to have lived, so far as ordinary observers could see and judge, upon fairly good terms. As if Edwin was not already eccentric enough, Dr. Leach also testified to the court that towards the end of December, he had had a conversation with Edwin concerning mesmerism. Edwin, in the presence of Adelaide, had asked the doctor if he thought such things could be possible, and if he could offer any advice. He told the doctor, "I am doing such strange things against my common sense. In fact, both my wife and I are both doing so." Despite the doctor finding the conversation more than a little strange, and Adelaide's chafing, Leach probed Edwin on the matter, concerned for his rationality and mental well-being, and asked him if he found the idea of being under control of another to be troubling. However, to the contrary, Edwin simply replied that he liked it, and Adelaide chimed in that he was a dear friend to both of us. This strongly suggested that Edwin might have been having a change of heart toward his dear friend George Dyson and their complicated agreement between himself, the Reverend, and Adelaide. All 4 doctors further testified to the difficulty of killing someone with chloroform. The defence called no witness. However, at the end of the trial, Edward Clark gave a 6-hour-long closing speech highlighting suicide and drawing particular attention to a lack of motive within the case. The jury were out for only a short time, and when court reconvened to hear the verdict, it was given as such. Although we think grave suspicion is attached to the prisoner, we do not think there is sufficient evidence to show how or by whom the chloroform was administered. Adelaide was found not guilty. As a case that is grounded in normality, the theories behind the death of Thomas Edwin Bartlett are quite simple, that of murder, accident, or suicide. It is the individual motives for each where speculation is able to run rampant. No single theory answers all the questions, and many simply demand more. By many, murder has always been the first and foremost line of suspicion. Adelaide herself had remarked to Dr. Leach earlier in December before Edwin's death, "If Mr. Bartlett does not get better soon, his friends will accuse me of poisoning him." Indeed, there is much to be suspicious of. Why had she thrown away the bottle of chloroform if it really had been unused and unopened? And why had she seemed so highly strung when it was mentioned by the Reverend? The Reverend also seemed to suffer an element of guilt, suggesting that perhaps he also suspected Adelaide to a degree. In January, their relationship appeared strained, and at this time he returned a watch to Adelaide that Edwin had left to him, along with a reasonable chunk of money that had been given to him for expenses for visiting Adelaide by Edwin. On the other hand, however, she appeared to cooperate in many aspects of the case. The doctor remarked how she had cared most affectionately for Edwin throughout his illness, and to all outside onlookers, their relationship was perfectly stable. Furthermore, all of the doctors testified as to the difficulty of using chloroform for murder, stating that only about 30% of subjects die from ingesting the liquid poison, and though in these cases all were receiving medical care at the time, most deaths had taken between 48 hours to a week to die. It had only been observed in a very small portion of cases the subjects had died quickly. It was also remarked to the amount that would be needed to kill, suggesting around 3/4 of an ounce might be enough. Though Adelaide certainly had enough of the poison, how then had she managed to coerce Edwin into ingesting it? And how exactly had she done so without leaving any burns around the mouth? The main theory suggests that she would have at first to use the chloroform on a handkerchief or similar to lull Edwin into an anaesthetized stupor before pouring it down his throat. Dr. Murray, one of the doctors who undertook the postmortem, testified at the trial that, if the insensibility was profound, there would be no difficulty that I can see. It could be poured down. However, in order for this to have been effective, the condition of Edwin would have had to have maintained a fine balance between stupor and his ability to retain muscle reactions, allowing him to swallow. Chloroform being a rather volatile substance, this was no easy task, even for anaesthetists of the time. Chloroform was routinely used as shampoo throughout the Victorian era, and clients were told to eat well before visiting the salon and would be seen to by an open window. Such was the unpredictability of its efficiency. On the subject of motive, most presume that despite outward appearances, Adelaide was unhappy with the current situation and would simply have been happier with Edwin out of the picture, so to speak. Here, she would have been free to marry the Reverend. Whether or not that was enough is a matter of mystery. The second theory concerning Edwin's death is that of suicide. The defence pushed the line hard throughout the trial and in Edward Clark's 6-hour-long closing speech. Most of it emphasised Edwin's lack of grasp on reality with his own health, and chiefly that he seemed to be somewhat obsessed with the idea he was suffering from a terminal illness. Edward Clark stated that Edwin, afraid he was dying and having knowledge of the chloroform, filled the wineglass full of the poison, drank it whilst Adelaide was not in the room, and Adelaide had used the same glass to fill with brandy upon finding him dead, thus disguising the smell. If this were truly the case, however, why then had Edwin ordered breakfast? He was also apparently in good spirits, and his health had been steadily returning throughout the end of December. If we are to believe Adelaide's words, he had even renewed his sexual advances towards her, though some say that her outright disallowing of said advances could also have been motive enough for him to kill himself. We can also look at his conversation with the doctor concerning mesmerism with renewed suspicion in the light of a suicide. Was Edwin now regretting an earlier decision to include the Reverend so deeply within his marriage? There is one other line of thought concerning the death of Edwin, that of accidental death, though even at the time it was considered as only an outside possibility. It is posited by some that Edwin, after waking and in a drowsy state, could have reached for the bottle of chloroform on the mantelpiece thinking it some other medicine and drank it mistakenly. However, would he not have realised his mistake quite quickly, and if that was the case, why would he have quietly laid back down and died? It seems quite unlikely that Edwin would not have woken Adelaide, either intentionally or through his sheer panic of having ingested a wineglass full of poison. After the trial was concluded and Adelaide was found not guilty, both herself and the Reverend George Dyson withdrew from the public eye. What became of the pair only exists in rumours, however most agree that the couple never met again. Adelaide was heavily rumoured to have emigrated to the US, where she lived quietly until her death in 1933. There is little other details available as to her life, she simply vanished from trace. The Reverend has been the subject of much more exciting rumours, and one states that after the trial, he too emigrated to the US, taking up residence in New York City, where he married a wealthy young woman who he promptly murdered for her estate. Given his character and all we know about him through the trial notes, this seems highly unlikely, however. Another rumour, which seems much more probable, if a little less intriguing, suggests that he emigrated to Australia and took up position in a church there, living a quiet and peaceful life until his later death. This can be backed up to a certain extent through the church records, which show a British man named Dyson doing exactly that. One statement which altogether makes the case more murky was given by Dr. Leach when he was asked about Adelaide's state upon finding her husband to be dead. He stated, "She seemed not only grieved but very much alarmed, very much scared." As for the Reverend, it seems apparent that he was naive in the extreme, and there are many that presume he was manipulated by Adelaide into both buying the chloroform and keeping quiet about it after the fact. Edwin's father certainly did not trust Adelaide, though it could be said they had a difficult past. He even questioned the veracity of the will and had the witnesses called upon in court to testify that Edwin himself had in fact signed the document. Even if we are to discount theories and motives for a moment, the Pimlico poisoning case still leaves us with the biggest mystery, chiefly, how on earth was the chloroform ingested without causing any traces of passing through his system? We are drawn back to the original question from the trial: how came the chloroform there? This is a question that could provide answers, but ultimately leaves us with only more speculation and guesswork, probably for the rest of time. In the days after the trial, Sir James Paget, a renowned surgeon responsible for laying the foundations of scientific medical pathology, wrote publicly in a piece for a medical journal, "Now that she has been acquitted for murder and cannot be tried again, she should tell us in the interest of science how she did it." Thanks for listening. Please rate, subscribe, and sleep tight. Thanks for listening. I think it's fair to say that was a pretty bizarre case. And at times it kind of reminded me a little bit of The Talented Mr. Ripley, especially when Edwin wrote the pretty odd letter to the Reverend. I think when usually looking at these sorts of cases, everyone, and myself included, as a kind of nailed on suspect or some idea of what happened. But in this case, I really don't know. Was it Adelaide incredibly smart and calculated, or just incredibly stupid? I guess, I don't know. I guess that's the mystery, isn't it? But yeah, anyway, thanks for listening. If you want to contact me, I'm mostly active on Twitter at Dark Histories. There's a Facebook page at facebook.com/Dark Histories podcast, which would be cool if we could get that a little bit more active. And I have my own website, which is darkhistories.com, where you can find all sorts of stuff on there, including show notes, full scripts. Sometimes do maps. Well, most of the time I do maps for each episode, and there's also links to some of the research sources that are online. So yeah, you should check that out. That's darkhistories.com. And I'd also like to thank Elsie Vega, who became my second patron on Patreon this week. And that's a really huge thank you. It really helps me out. And on that subject, whilst I've never really mentioned it before or made much of a fuss about it, I do have a Patreon page. I guess we can call this its official launch, if you like. So if you fancy supporting the podcast, you can do that over there. For $1, what are my tiers? So for $1, you get your name added to a list of supporters on our website. For $3, you get the next tier, and you get early access to the shows each week. And the $5 tier gets all of that, plus access to a bi-weekly Google Hangout that I'm going to do, where we can discuss past and future shows, or just about anything else really. And you'll also get access to PDFs of my research notes on each show. Now, I should probably state that they are in my own handwriting, so their legibility is questionable at best. They also only start from episode 21, as I deleted all of my older notes like a proper plum. So anyway, you can find all those details if you head over to the support page on my website, and that's at darkhistories.com. So yeah, finally, if you like the podcast and can see it in your heart to leave us a review in your app of listening choice, that goes a super long way to helping me out. And thanks very much. See you next week. Cheers.